We're incredibly grateful for your support. Before we begin today's tale, tell us, which city or country are you joining us from? We love connecting with our global audience. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Beneath the Surface. Arthur Art Bellwether's nostrils twitched at the pungent lemon scent wafting from his mop bucket as he pushed it down the hallway of Sterling and Hayes law firm. The fluorescent lights hummed above, a constant drone that matched the dull throb in his lower back. At 38, he wasn't old, but the physical demands of janitorial work left their mark. A group of associates rushed past him, their designer shoes clicking against the floor. None spared him a glance. Art kept his head down, continuing his work with practiced efficiency. He learned early on that invisibility was both a curse and a blessing in this place. "Mr. Bellwether?" A young paralegal approached him hesitantly. "There's been a spill in conference room 3. "I'll take care of it," Art replied, his voice gentle and unremarkable. The paralegal nodded and hurried away, already forgetting his existence. The conference room door was ajar, and voices drifted out. Art recognized one immediately, Beatrice, his wife. He paused, listening despite himself. "God, I can't believe I have to go home to that. That janitor." Beatrice's voice dripped with contempt. "Do you know what he did this morning? Left his dirty work shoes by the door. Like some kind of servant." Laughter followed, feminine, masculine, cruel. Art's fingers tightened around the mop handle until his knuckles whitened. He waited until the voices faded before entering the room. The coffee spill was extensive, brown liquid seeping into the carpet. As Art worked to clean it, his mind wandered to the apartment he shared with Beatrice. Once, it had been filled with warmth and possibility. Now, it was a battleground of silent wars and cold shoulders. That evening, Art arrived home first. Their apartment, while modestly furnished, bore all the hallmarks of Beatrice's taste. Clean lines, minimal decoration, nothing out of place. He removed his shoes carefully, placing them in the designated rack she'd installed. The door opened precisely at 7. Beatrice swept in, her navy power suit immaculate, her dark hair perfectly styled. She paused when she saw him. "You're in my way," she said, not meeting his eyes. Art stepped aside. "I made dinner. I ate at the office." She moved past him, her expensive perfume lingering in her wake. "And please change out of those clothes. They smell like cleaning supplies." Later that night, Art sat in his study, the smallest room in the apartment, which Beatrice had generously allowed him to use. He opened his laptop, logging into the Sterling and Hayes private server with credentials none of his coworkers knew existed. The screen displayed financial reports, case files, employee records, everything happening at the firm he secretly owned. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory. "Listen here, boy," Harold Bellwether had said, his voice gruff, but his eyes kind. "This firm isn't just about making money. It's about understanding people. You can't lead what you don't understand. Promise me you'll work every position before taking over. Promise me you'll learn." Art had promised. He'd started in the mailroom, learning the rhythms of communication flow. He'd worked reception, observing the power dynamics played out in greetings and wait times. As a paralegal, he'd understood the backbone of legal research. Now, as a janitor, he saw everything: the affairs, the backstabbing, the real faces behind professional masks. He'd planned to reveal himself after completing this final position. Then he met Beatrice. She'd been different then. Or perhaps he'd been too blinded by love to see her true nature. She'd smiled at him, talked to him, made him feel seen when he was used to being invisible. He'd fallen hard and fast, convincing himself that if she could love him as a janitor, their love would be real. A notification popped up on his screen, an email from Beatrice to the hiring committee regarding janitorial staff compensation review. "I recommend against any increases. These positions require minimal skill and are easily replaceable. We should maintain current rates to protect profit margins." Art's jaw clenched. He closed the laptop with deliberate care, though his hands shook slightly. In the bathroom mirror, he studied his reflection. His features were handsome in an understated way, his brown eyes intelligent behind simple glasses. He'd cultivated this appearance of mediocrity, but underneath burned something far more dangerous. The next morning, he arrived early at Sterling and Hayes. In the empty halls, he moved with a different posture, straight-backed, purposeful. He entered his grandfather's old office, now used for storage, and unlocked the hidden wall safe behind a filing cabinet. Inside lay documents that could reshape the firm in an instant. As he replaced the documents and resumed his janitor's slouch, Art allowed himself a small smile. Let them underestimate him. Let them mock and ignore him. Soon, they would understand exactly who they'd been disrespecting. He pushed his mop bucket down the hall, watching as early arriving lawyers stepped around him without a glance. Each dismissal, each sneer, each moment of disrespect, he filed them away, adding fuel to the fire burning inside him. They thought him weak, submissive, a man without pride or power. They would learn how wrong they were. Through the glass walls of her office, he saw Beatrice preparing for court, her movements confident and practiced. She caught his eye for a moment, and her lip curled in that familiar expression of disdain. Art turned away, his face carefully blank. Let her think she had the upper hand. Let her believe she'd married beneath her. Soon enough, she would understand the magnitude of her mistake. And when that day came, he would show no mercy. Because Arthur Bellwether was many things, patient, observant, calculating, but forgiving wasn't one of them. Chapter 2. The Shattering Truth. The night shift at Sterling and Hayes offered Art a different perspective on the firm. Without the constant bustle of lawyers and clients, he could observe the building's pulse, who stayed late, which offices held secrets, what conversations weren't meant for daylight hours. He pushed his cleaning cart past the senior partner's offices, pausing as a muffled sound caught his attention. A sob, raw and guttural, echoed from Beatrice's office. The door was slightly ajar, a slice of light spilling into the darkened hallway. "I can't take it anymore, Monty." Beatrice's voice trembled. Living with him, pretending. Art's hand froze on the cart handle. He stood motionless, his breathing shallow. "You don't have to stay with him," a male voice responded. Montgomery Finch, the senior partner. His tone carried the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "You're worth 10 of him, B. You don't understand." Beatrice's voice hardened. "You're nothing but trash I settled for, Art." Her words, meant for a phone conversation with Monty, sliced through the air. "I'm sleeping with the senior partner, you idiot. He treats me like a woman, not some cleaning rag." The cleaning rag in Art's hand dropped silently to the floor. His vision tunneled, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder in his ears. Through the crack in the door, he could see Beatrice pacing, her phone pressed to her ear, her face contorted with disgust. "Do you know what it's like?" she continued, venom dripping from every word. "Watching him shuffle around with that pathetic mop, wearing those cheap clothes, living in that mediocre apartment. I thought I could change him, mold him into something better. But he's just nothing. Leave him." Monty's voice purred through the speaker. "Move in with me. I'll give you everything he can't." Art's fingers curled into fists, his nails digging crescents into his palms. The pain anchored him, kept him from bursting through the door. Years of careful observation had taught him the value of patience, of gathering information before striking. "Soon," Beatrice promised. "I just need to figure out the right way to break him. I want him to know exactly how little he means to me." A cruel laugh accompanied her words, and Art felt something inside him crystallize. The last traces of love, of hope for reconciliation, hardened into something darker, colder. He retrieved his cleaning rag with steady hands, his movements mechanical. Inside, his mind was already calculating, planning, preparing for what needed to be done. The next day unfolded like a surreal theater production. Art watched from his carefully maintained position of invisibility as Beatrice and Monty played out their affair in plain sight. The lingering touches, the meaningful glances, the inside jokes, all performed with the confidence of people who believed their audience didn't matter. "Hey, janitor." Monty's voice boomed across the lobby. He deliberately dropped his coffee cup, dark liquid spreading across the polished floor. "Clean that up." Art approached with his mop, keeping his eyes downcast. Up close, he could study Montgomery Finch in detail. The silver hair that women found distinguished, the expensive suit that spoke of success, the signet ring that flashed as he gestured dismissively. Honestly, Monty spoke to a junior associate, not bothering to lower his voice. I don't know why we keep these people around. They're barely competent. The junior associate laughed nervously, glancing at Art before quickly looking away. Art continued mopping, his movements unhurried, methodical. He noted how Monty's shoes were slightly scuffed at the heels, a detail that suggested carelessness, a potential weakness. Later, in the break room, Art endured another performance. Beatrice held court among her colleagues, her voice carrying deliberately. Marriage is such an institution, she sighed dramatically. Sometimes I think I'm married beneath me just to prove I could lift someone up. But you can't help those who won't help themselves, right? Her audience tittered appreciatively. Art emptied the trash bins, his presence barely registering in their consciousness. He observed how Beatrice's hand shook slightly as she set down her coffee cup, how her laughter held a brittle edge. More weaknesses to catalog, more ammunition to store. That night, in their apartment, Beatrice didn't even bother with pretense. I'll be working late, she announced, applying fresh lipstick in the hallway mirror. Don't wait up. With Monty? Art asked quietly. Beatrice froze for a fraction of a second before recovering. What did you say? Nothing. Art adjusted his janitor's uniform. Have a good night. He watched her leave, noted the slight hesitation in her step, the tension in her shoulders. She thought she was the one in control, the one orchestrating the destruction of their marriage. She had no idea she was merely an actor in a different play altogether. In his study, Art accessed the firm's servers again. He began pulling files, cases Beatrice and Monty had worked together, financial records, email exchanges. Each document was a piece of a puzzle, and Art was very, very good at puzzles. Hours passed as he built his case, constructed his strategy. The screen's glow illuminated his features, highlighting the transformation taking place. Gone was the passive mask of the humble janitor. In its place sat a man whose calculated rage promised retribution. He thought of his grandfather, wondered if the old man had foreseen this possibility when he'd insisted Art learn the firm from the ground up. The lessons weren't just about understanding employees. They were about understanding human nature, about recognizing the difference between appearance and reality. Art closed his laptop, sat back in his chair, and allowed himself to fully embrace the cold fury that had been building since he'd heard Beatrice's confession. He would show them all exactly who they'd been dealing with. And when he was done, there would be nothing left of their carefully constructed worlds but ashes. The humble janitor was a lie, a carefully crafted illusion. The truth was far more dangerous. And soon, very soon, they would all learn just how dangerous Arthur Bellwether could be. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Art sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and multiple computer screens. The clock read 3 a.m., but sleep was far from his mind. On one screen, financial records scrolled past. Years of transactions, client billings, expense reports. On another, emails between Monty and various clients revealed patterns of deception that would make any ethics board member's blood run cold. His grandfather's notes lay open beside him, leather-bound journals filled with observations about every aspect of the firm. Harold Bellwether had been more than just a successful lawyer. He'd been a master strategist who understood that true power lay in knowledge. A knock at his study door broke his concentration. Art, why are you still awake? Working, he replied, not looking up from his screens. Beatrice pushed the door open, wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than a janitor's monthly salary. In that tiny room? It's pathetic. You should be sleeping. Don't you have toilets to clean tomorrow? Art's fingers paused on the keyboard. You're right. I should sleep. Of course I'm right. She turned away, then paused. Oh, and don't forget to take out the trash before you leave for work. It's starting to smell. The door closed behind her. Art waited until her footsteps faded before pulling out his phone and dialing a number. Do you know what time it is? A groggy voice answered. Jax, I need your help. Jasper Jax. Thorne was exactly what Art expected from their phone conversations. A lanky man with wild hair and clothes that looked like they'd been picked up off the floor. They met in a 24-hour diner far from Sterling and Hayes. So, let me get this straight, Jax said, adding a 6-sugar packet to his coffee. You want me to create a monitoring system for a law firm's internal network? That's some serious nerd stuff, man. Can you do it? Jax's eyes lit up with the gleam of a true technophile presented with a challenge. Can I do it? Buddy, I once broke into the Pentagon's coffee machine network for fun. This is child's play. I need it to be untraceable. Duh. Jax stirred his coffee with manic energy. But here's the real question. Why does a janitor need this kind of system? Art's face remained impassive. Do you want the job or not? Oh, I want it. You're weird, and weird is interesting. Jax pulled out a laptop covered in stickers. Let's talk specifics. The next morning, Art arrived early at Sterling and Hayes. He had another meeting scheduled, this one in the parking garage. Margaret Maggie Davies waited by her car, her posture straight, her expression thoughtful. Unlike Jax's chaos, Maggie radiated calm competence. She'd been Art's classmate years ago, before he'd begun his journey through the firm's ranks. I always wondered about you, she said by way of greeting. The brilliant law student who disappeared after graduation. Now I find out you're working as a janitor in your own firm. My grandfather's condition for inheritance, Art explained. I needed to understand every position. And you met her during this experiment? Art's jaw tightened. Yes. Maggie's eyes softened with understanding, but not pity. Never pity. What do you need from me? Your skills, your discretion, your ability to read people and predict their moves. You're planning something big? Yes. Maggie studied him for a long moment. The Art I knew in law school was brilliant but kind. This version of you, you're something else entirely. Will you help? Yes. She straightened her blazer. Because the Art I knew was also just an I trust that hasn't changed. Over the next few weeks, Art orchestrated his plan with precision. During the day, he maintained his janitor persona, watching as Beatrice and Monty grew bolder in their affair. At night, he worked with Jax to monitor the firm's digital pulse and with Maggie to predict and counter every possible move his targets might make. The evidence mounted. Monty's illegal activities weren't just unethical, they were criminal. Client funds disappeared into offshore accounts. Cases were won through blackmail and fabricated evidence. And Beatrice, his brilliant, ambitious wife, was neck-deep in it all. Look at this, Jax said during one of their late-night meetings, spinning his laptop around. Your wife's got a real talent for creative bookkeeping. These case expenses? Total fiction. And Monty's been skimming from client accounts for years. Can you trace it all? Already done. Man, when this hits, it's going to be biblical. Art nodded, then turned to Maggie. What's your assessment? She tapped her fingers on the table, thinking. Monty's arrogant. He'll try to bluff his way out, claim ignorance. Beatrice will attempt to leverage your marriage, play the victim. We need to cut off all escape routes before we move. The board meeting is scheduled for next week, Art said. Everything needs to be perfect. It will be, Maggie assured him. They won't know what hit them. Back at the apartment, Art watched Beatrice prepare for another late night at the office. She barely acknowledged him as she gathered her things. Don't forget to clean the bathroom, she called over her shoulder. The maid's coming tomorrow, and I don't want her to see what a mess you've made. The door closed behind her. Art walked to the window, watching as she met Monty in his expensive car down the street. They didn't even try to be discreet anymore. He returned to his study, reviewing the final preparations for the board meeting. Each document was in place, each piece of evidence verified and backed up. He thought about his grandfather, wondered if the old man would approve of what he was about to do. Power without purpose is meaningless, Harold had told him once. But purpose without power is helpless. Art had found his purpose in the betrayal of the woman he'd loved and the corruption of the firm his grandfather had built. Now he would show them all exactly how much power he possessed. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would sweep away everything in its path. Art was done being invisible, done being underestimated, done being treated like something less than what he was. Let them laugh. Let them mock. Let them continue their games and schemes and betrayals. Their time was running out. Chapter 4. The morning after. Art adjusted his tailored Armani suit in the mirror of his grandfather's old office. Gone were the janitor's uniform and the slumped shoulders. His posture was straight, commanding, his eyes sharp behind designer frames that replaced his simple glasses. The transformation wasn't just physical, it radiated from within. He checked his watch, 8:45 a.m. The firm-wide meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. By now, Jax would have locked down all digital systems, preventing any last-minute deletion of files or evidence. Maggie would be positioned strategically, ready to observe and document reactions. The conference room, the same one where he'd overheard countless conversations between Beatrice and Monty, was filling up. Through the glass walls, he could see the confusion on people's faces. Where was the CEO? Why had security stationed themselves at all exits? Art's phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. They're all here. Monty's trying to take control of the meeting. Beatrice looks nervous. He waited 5 more minutes, letting the tension build. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked toward the conference room. The click of his Italian leather shoes against the floor announced his approach. Heads turned as he entered. Beatrice, mid-conversation with a junior associate, froze. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped her designer pen, so tightly her knuckles whitened. What's the janitor doing here? Monty's voice carried across the room, dripping with disdain. Security? I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Finch, Art said, his voice carrying an authority that made several people straighten in their chairs. How dare you, Beatrice started, but her voice died as Art moved to the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, he addressed the room, I apologize for any confusion. Allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Arthur Bellwether, sole owner of Sterling and Hayes. The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the whispers, the gasps, the shocked exchanges of glances. Beatrice's face had lost all color, while Monty's had turned an interesting shade of purple. This is ridiculous, Monty sputtered. I've been senior partner here for 15 years. I've never heard of you. Haven't you? Art activated the presentation screen behind him. Because according to these records, you've been embezzling from my firm for at least 10 of those years. Financial statements appeared on the screen, highlighted sections showing discrepancies in client billing, unauthorized transfers, and falsified expense reports. These are confidential files. Monty stood, his voice rising. You have no right. I have right. Art cut him off, his tone glacial. Let me be clear about what you're looking at. These documents show systematic theft from client accounts, fraudulent billing practices, and multiple ethics violations that would make the State Bar Association very interested. The room erupted in murmurs. Board members leaned forward, examining the evidence with growing concern. Junior partners exchanged worried glances. This is a mistake. Monty tried again, but his voice had lost its confidence. These numbers can be explained. By all means, Art gestured to the screen. Explain how client funds repeatedly found their way into your personal offshore accounts. Explain the pattern of falsified billable hours. Explain the bribes. With each accusation, more documents appeared on screen. Art moved around the table, his presence commanding attention. I've spent months documenting fraud, corruption, and ethical violations that would destroy this firm if made public. Mr. Finch isn't just a thief. He's a cancer that's been eating away at Sterling and Hayes from the inside. Beatrice stood suddenly. You can't just come in here and make these accusations. Sit down, Mrs. Bellwether. Art's voice could have frozen fire. Your turn is coming. She sank back in her chair, her usual confidence shattered. Security, Art nodded to the men at the door. Please escort Mr. Finch from the building. The State Bar Association representatives are waiting in the lobby. You can't do this. Monty shouted as security approached. Do you know who I am? A thief, Art replied calmly. A fraud. And as of this moment, a former employee of Sterling and Hayes. The room watched in stunned silence as Monty was led out, his protests echoing down the hallway. Art turned to address the remaining staff. For those wondering about my authority here, my grandfather was Harold Bellwether, the firm's founder. Upon his death, ownership passed to me, with the condition that I work in position at the firm before taking control. I've spent the past years honoring that promise, learning this firm from the ground up. Recognition dawned on several faces. Older partners who had known Harold, who could now see the family resemblance. The corruption stops today, Art continued. Those who have participated in Mr. Finch's schemes have a choice. Come forward voluntarily, and we can discuss terms. Try to hide, and I will find you. I have evidence on activities stretching back years. The threat hung in the air, clear and unmistakable. Several lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This meeting is adjourned. Department heads stay behind. Everyone else, return to your offices and await further instructions. As people filed out, Art caught fragments of conversations. Did you know? The janitor. All this time, what about his wife? Beatrice remained seated, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Art approached her, leaning down to speak quietly. My office. 10 minutes. Don't even think about leaving the building. She opened her mouth to respond, but he had already turned away, discussing something with Maggie who had materialized at his side. Through the glass walls, the remaining staff could see Monty being escorted out by security, followed by representatives from the State Bar. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as he gestured wildly, trying to explain himself to deaf ears. Art watched the scene with cold satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. The next would be even more devastating. Because unlike Monty, who was merely greedy and corrupt, Beatrice had committed a far greater sin in Art's eyes. She had made him love her, then treated that love with contempt. And for that, there would be no mercy. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. Art sat behind his grandfather's mahogany desk, now restored to its former glory. The nameplate reading Arthur Bellwether so gleamed under the office lights. He reviewed the documents spread before him, evidence of Beatrice's misdeeds, carefully compiled over months of surveillance. A knock at the door. Mrs. Bellwether is here, his new secretary announced. Send her in. Beatrice entered, her designer heels clicking against the floor. Her makeup was perfect, her suit immaculate, but Art could see the slight tremor in her hands. Please, Art, she began, her voice honey-sweet. Let's talk about this like rational people. Sit down. She perched on the chair across from him, crossing her legs and leaning forward slightly, a pose she'd used countless times to manipulate judges and opponents. You have to understand, darling. I was shocked, hurt even, that you'd keep such a secret from me. Art didn't respond. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Send in the files. 2 security guards entered, carrying boxes of documents. They placed them on the desk and left silently. What are those? Beatrice's voice wavered. Your legacy. Art opened the first box. The Wilson case. You bribed a witness. The Martinez settlement. You blackmailed the opposing counsel. The Peterson divorce. You fabricated evidence. Those are lies. Are they? He turned his laptop screen toward her. Here's your email to the witness in the Wilson case, detailing the payment. Here's the recording of your conversation with Martinez's lawyer. Here's the original document you altered in the Peterson case. Beatrice's facade cracked. You spied on me? I observed. I documented. I built a case. Art's voice remained steady. Just like you taught me to do, remember? All those nights you came home complaining about how much work it took to build a solid case. You can't use this, she said, desperation creeping into her tone. I'm your wife. You're nothing but trash I settled for. Art quoted her words back to her. Isn't that what you said? Her face paled. You heard. I heard everything, Beatrice. Your affair with Monty. Your contempt for me. Your mockery of our marriage. I didn't mean. Don't. Art's voice cut like a blade. Don't insult us both by lying now. He stood walking around the desk. You know what's interesting? When I started gathering evidence about Monty's corruption, I expected to find you were clean. Ambitious, yes. Cruel, certainly. But I thought you were at least an ethical lawyer. He pulled out another file. Instead, I found this pattern of behavior. You didn't just bend rules. You broke them. Repeatedly. Systematically. You built your entire career on lies and manipulation. Everything I did was for success, she protested. This firm rewards results. Not anymore. Art pressed another button on his phone. Send them in. The door opened again. 2 representatives from the State Bar Association entered, followed by Maggie, who carried additional files. No, Beatrice whispered. No, you can't. Mrs. Bellwether. One of the bar representatives stepped forward. We need to discuss some serious ethical violations that have been brought to our attention. Art, please. She turned to him, tears forming in her eyes. We can work this out. We're married. We're married. He corrected her. The divorce papers are in that box too, along with evidence of your affairs. Plural. By the way, Monty wasn't the only one, was he? She flinched. You have a choice. Art continued. Sign the papers, admit to your ethical violations, and accept disbarment quietly. Or fight, and I'll make sure every detail becomes public record. You can't destroy me like this. She stood, anger replacing fear. I made you. Without me, you'd still be nothing but a janitor. Art's laugh was cold. You never made me anything, Beatrice. You just revealed your own emptiness. He nodded to security. Clear out her office. I want everything gone within the hour. Any personal items can be sent to her new address. I believe Monty's guest house is available, now that he's facing criminal charges. You'll regret this, she hissed, her mask completely gone now. I'll fight you. I'll tell everyone what you did. Tell them what? That your husband owned the firm where you committed multiple ethics violations? That you cheated on him while mocking his supposed low status? Please do share that story. I'm sure it will help your defense at the disciplinary hearing. Beatrice's shoulders slumped as the reality of her situation sank in. Everything she'd built, everything she'd schemed for, was crumbling around her. Security will escort you to your office to collect any immediate personal items, Art said. After that, you're barred from the building. The divorce papers require your signature by end of day. And if I don't sign, then tomorrow, every media outlet in the city receives proof of your affairs, your ethical violations, and your abuse of firm resources. Your choice. She stared at him, seeing for the first time not the submissive husband she'd belittled, but the ruthless operator who'd orchestrated her downfall. I loved you once, she said quietly. No, Art replied. You love the idea of being better than me. There's a difference. He turned to the bar representatives. She's all yours. As Beatrice was let out, Maggie approached his desk. The staff's watching. Word spreading about both her and Monty. Good. Art straightened his tie. Let them see what happens to those who abuse their position. Let them understand that Sterling and Hayes has changed. Through the office windows, he could see Beatrice being escorted to her office. Her head held high, but her steps unsteady. Staff members quickly looked away as she passed, already distancing themselves from her downfall. Art felt no satisfaction, no joy in her destruction. Only a cold sense of justice served. She had chosen her path, betrayed not just him, but her professional ethics and responsibilities. Now she would face the consequences. Because Arthur Bellwether might have played the role of a humble janitor, but he was his grandfather's heir in more ways than one. And like Harold before him, he believed in justice, swift, complete, and unforgiving. Chapter 6. The Voicemail. The aftermath of Art's revelation rippled through Sterling and Hayes like a shockwave. Staff members spoke in whispers, glancing nervously at his office door. The firm's atmosphere crackled with tension and uncertainty. Fourth senior partner this week, Maggie reported, dropping a file on Art's desk. Another one of Monty's conspirators trying to jump ship before we expose them. Let them run, Art replied, signing another termination notice. Jax has tracked all their communications. We have everything we need. The junior associates are terrified, she observed. They think you're going to clean house entirely. Only the corrupt ones. Art looked up from his paperwork. Speaking of which, how's the transition team doing? Rebuilding the firm's ethical foundation isn't easy, but we're making progress. I've identified several promising attorneys who stayed clean despite pressure from Monty and his crew. A knock interrupted them. Jax poked his head in, his usual chaotic energy somewhat subdued. Hey boss, you need to hear this. He placed a phone on the desk, pressed play. Beatrice's voice filled the room, brittle and desperate. Arthur, please. I know you're there. I know you're listening. I made a mistake. I see that now. Everything I had, everything I was, it's gone. I can't find work. No firm will touch me. Monty's facing criminal charges, his assets are frozen. I have nowhere to go. Nothing left. Please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Just call me back. Please. The message ended. Silence filled the office. "That's the third one today," Jack said quietly. "They're getting worse. Delete them all," Art commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Art," Maggie started, but he cut her off. "She made her choices, Maggie. She chose to mock me, to cheat on me, to break her professional ethics. Everything happening to her now is a consequence of her own actions." "I'm not defending her," Maggie replied carefully. "But the staff is watching how you handle this. Your response sets the tone for the firm's future." Art stood, walking to his office door. The outer office was busy with activity, lawyers and paralegals adapting to the new reality of Sterling and Hayes under his leadership. "Listen up," he called out, his voice carrying across the space. The room fell silent immediately. "I know there are rumors, questions about the future of this firm. Let me be clear. Sterling and Hayes is not just changing leadership. We're changing culture." He surveyed the faces before him. The corruption, the ethical violations, the abuse of power, it ends now. Those who participated in Monty Finch's schemes have two choices: come forward voluntarily or be exposed. Those who maintain their integrity despite pressure will be recognized and rewarded. A young associate raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Bellwether, about Mrs. Bellwether's cases. All active cases previously handled by Beatrice Bellwether or Montgomery Finch will be reviewed for ethical violations," Art stated firmly. "Any clients harmed by their actions will be compensated. Any violations of law or ethics will be reported to the proper authorities. But the cost," someone started, "is irrelevant compared to the firm's integrity," Art finished. "My grandfather built Sterling and Hayes on principles of justice and ethical practice. We're returning to those principles, whatever it takes." As the staff absorbed his words, another phone message notification buzzed. Art glanced at the screen. Another voicemail from Beatrice. "Mr. Bellwether," his secretary called out. "The divorce papers have been signed and filed, and the State Bar Association has confirmed Mrs. Bellwether's disbarment hearing date." Art nodded, deleting the notification without listening to the message. "Maggie, prepare a press release about the firm's restructuring. Jax, continue monitoring for any attempts at retaliation or data theft. Everyone else, back to work. We have a firm to rebuild." Later that night, Art sat in his office, reviewing personnel files. The phone rang again, Beatrice's number. He let it go to voicemail. Her voice, when it came through, was barely recognizable. "You've destroyed me, Arthur. Is that what you wanted? To reduce me to nothing? Congratulations. You've succeeded. I have nothing left. No career, no money, no future. Are you satisfied now? Does it make you feel powerful?" Art picked up the phone, his finger hovering over the delete button. In his mind, he saw Beatrice as she'd been: proud, ambitious, beautiful. Then he remembered her cruel words, her betrayals, her ethical violations. The message deleted with a single press. Outside his office, Sterling and Hayes was transforming. The old guard was being replaced by lawyers who valued integrity over profit. The toxic culture that had festered under Monty's influence was being excised like a tumor. And Beatrice was no longer his concern. She had made her choices, betrayed her vows, violated her professional ethics. Now she would live with the consequences. Because Art had learned something important during his time as a janitor. True character isn't revealed by power, but by how people treat those they believe to be powerless. Beatrice had shown her true character in how she'd treated him, and now she was facing the results of that revelation. The phone rang again. Art didn't even glance at the number. Some messages didn't deserve to be heard. Some betrayals couldn't be forgiven. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. And Arthur Bellwether, no longer the invisible janitor, but the ruthless CEO, had no more patience for those who hadn't learned that truth. Chapter 7. The Weight of Power. "Mr. Bellwether, the Robinson case files are ready for your review," a junior associate said, placing the documents on his desk with trembling hands. Art noticed how she backed away quickly, avoiding eye contact. The fear in her posture reminded him of how people used to avoid looking at him when he was the janitor, but for entirely different reasons now. "Thank you, Miss Chun," he replied, his voice neutral. She scurried out, closing the door behind her. The transformation of Sterling and Hayes under his leadership had been swift and absolute. The corrupt senior partners had been removed, their misdeeds exposed. Those who remained walked carefully, aware that their new CEO had eyes everywhere and showed no mercy to those who crossed ethical lines. "You're scaring them," Maggie observed from the doorway. She entered without waiting for permission, one of the few who dared. "Good," Art replied, reviewing the Robinson files. "Fear breeds compliance. Fear breeds mistakes," she countered, taking a seat across from him. "Terrified lawyers make careless errors. We need them sharp, not paralyzed." Art looked up, studying her. Maggie met his gaze steadily, one of the few people who could. She'd been his ally through everything, helping orchestrate Beatrice and Monty's downfall. Now she served as his partner, helping rebuild the firm from the ashes of corruption. "What do you suggest?" "Let them see more than just the ruthless CEO who destroyed his wife's career. Show them the man who values integrity, who rewards loyalty." "I'm not here to be their friend." "No," she agreed, "but you're here to build something lasting. Your grandfather understood that. It's why he made you work those positions, to understand the human element of running a firm." The mention of his grandfather made Art pause. He stood, walking to the cabinet where he kept Harold's journals. He wrote about balance. "Power without compassion becomes tyranny, but compassion without power becomes weakness. And which are you choosing?" Before Art could respond, Jax burst in, his usual chaotic energy filling the room. "Boss, you need to see this." The audit found something interesting in the Morrison account. Art raised an eyebrow at the interruption, but Jax had earned the right to break protocol. His technical expertise had been crucial in exposing the firm's corruption, and he continued to monitor for any signs of ethical violations. "Show me." Jax pulled up data on his tablet. Someone tried to access sealed files from the old cases. IP address traces back to a public library terminal. "Beatrice," Art said, voice hardening. "Most likely. The access pattern matches her old work habits. She's probably looking for leverage, something to negotiate with." "She won't find anything," Art stated flatly. "Those files are sealed for a reason. Should we block the attempts?" Jax asked. "No. Let her try. Document everything. If she attempts anything illegal, we'll add it to her disbarment record." Maggie watched this exchange with interest. "You're still monitoring her." "I monitor anyone who might threaten this firm." "The firm, or your pride?" Art's expression would have sent any other employee running, but Maggie held her ground. This was why he valued her. She wasn't afraid to challenge him. "The firm needs to set an example," he said finally. "Anyone who betrays our principles faces consequences. No exceptions." "Like the scholarship program?" she asked. Art nodded. The initiative had been his first major project after stabilizing the firm. Full rides for underprivileged law students, with guaranteed internships at Sterling and Hayes. It was his way of ensuring the next generation of lawyers understood the importance of ethics from the start. "Speaking of which," Jax interjected, "the first batch of applications is impressive. These kids have real potential. Select the top candidates," Art instructed. "I want to interview them personally." Both Maggie and Jax stared at him. "What?" he demanded. The feared CEO of Sterling and Hayes, personally interviewing scholarship candidates? Jax grinned. "That'll start some rumors. Let them talk. These students represent our future. I want to make sure they understand what that means." A knock interrupted them. Art's secretary entered with a stack of papers. "The quarterly reports, sir. And there's someone here to see you. A former client of Mrs. Bellwether's." Art's expression darkened. "Show them in." The client, a middle-aged businessman, entered nervously. "Mr. Bellwether, I need to confess something. Mrs. Bellwether, she helped me hide assets during my divorce. Illegally. I want to make it right." Art exchanged glances with Maggie. Another piece of Beatrice's corrupt legacy. Another mess to clean up. "Sit down," he commanded. "Tell me everything." As the man spoke, Art felt the familiar cold rage building. Not just at Beatrice's actions, but at how deeply the corruption had run, how many lives had been affected. "We'll correct this," he told the client. "But it will cost you anything." The man agreed quickly. "Triple the hidden amount, donated to domestic violence shelters. Plus full disclosure to the court. Those are my terms. The client paled but nodded. After he left, Maggie approached Art's desk. That was unexpectedly fair. Justice isn't about revenge, Art replied. It's about restoration. Making things right. Is that why you're so hard on the staff? Trying to restore something? Art considered her question. I'm hard on them because excellence requires discipline. Because integrity isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement. Because this firm carries my grandfather's legacy, and I won't let it be corrupted again. And what about your legacy? She asked softly. What do you want people to remember about Arthur Bellwether's leadership? He looked out at the firm, watching his employees move through their day. They worked efficiently, professionally, with a new sense of purpose. The fear was there, yes, but so was pride in being part of a firm that stood for something. I want them to remember that actions have consequences, he said finally. That power comes with responsibility. That integrity isn't negotiable. And what about forgiveness? Art's expression hardened. Forgiveness is for those who deserve it. Beatrice chose her path. She, and anyone else who betrays this firm's principles, will face the consequences of that choice. The phone on his desk buzzed, another message from Beatrice. Art deleted it without listening. Some choices couldn't be undone. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. And Arthur Bellwether would make sure they were learned well. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Past. Art sat in the corner of his preferred coffee shop, reviewing contracts on his tablet. He'd chosen this place for its distance from Sterling and Hayes. No chance of running into employees, no need to maintain the imposing CEO facade. The bell above the door chimed. He didn't look up until he heard a familiar voice, now rough and uncertain. Yes, I'm available immediately. Any position? Yes, I understand it's entry-level. Beatrice stood at the counter, clutching a stack of papers. Her designer suits were gone, replaced by worn department store clothes. Her once perfect hair hung limp, her makeup minimal and poorly applied. She was handing out resumes to disinterested baristas. I have experience in no, I can't practice law anymore, but I have administrative skills. Her voice cracked slightly. Art watched, his face impassive. 6 months had passed since her disbarment. According to Jax's reports, she'd been blacklisted from most professional positions. Her attempts to leverage old connections had failed. No one wanted to risk association with her scandal. Please, she was saying to the manager. I'll take any shift, any hours. The manager glanced at her resume, then back at her. Look, lady, we don't hire people with your kind of history. Bad for business. Beatrice's shoulders slumped. She turned, probably heading for the next place on her list, when she saw Art. Their eyes met. Art noticed how she flinched, how her hand trembled as she gripped her papers tighter. For a brief moment, something that might have been pity flickered in his chest. Then he remembered her words. You're nothing but trash I settled for. He remembered her cruelty, her mockery, her betrayal. The pity vanished, replaced by cold indifference. Beatrice took a hesitant step toward his table. Art returned his attention to his tablet, dismissing her presence entirely. Art! Her voice was barely a whisper. Please. He continued reading his contracts, not acknowledging her existence. After what felt like an eternity, she turned and hurried out, dropping several resumes in her haste. Art's phone buzzed, a text from Maggie. Board meeting in 30. The merger proposal needs your review. He gathered his things, stepping over Beatrice's scattered papers without a second glance. Outside, he saw her entering another shop, shoulders hunched, desperation evident in her posture. Mr. Bellwether, a young woman approached him, one of the scholarship recipients. Her eyes shone with enthusiasm. I just wanted to thank you again for the opportunity. The internship has been incredible. Your work has been exemplary, Ms. Rodriguez, Art replied. Keep it up. As he walked to his car, he heard Beatrice's voice from the next shop. Please, I just need a chance. The contrast wasn't lost on him. One woman, who'd chosen ambition over ethics, now begged for menial work. Another, who'd earned her place through merit and integrity, was building a promising career. Back at Sterling and Hayes, Jax was waiting in his office. You saw her. he said without preamble. You're monitoring the coffee shop now? I monitor anything that might affect you or the firm. Jack shrugged. She's been trying to contact some of her old clients. Successfully? No. Your warning to the business community was quite thorough. Nobody will touch her. Art nodded, reviewing the merger documents. Good. She's running out of options, Jax continued. The apartment she got after the divorce, she can't afford it anymore. She's facing eviction. Not my concern. She might get desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. Art looked up, his expression glacial. Let her try. She lost everything because of her own choices, her own actions. If she makes another bad choice now, she'll face those consequences too. Cold boss. No, Jax. Just finished. She made her bed when she chose to mock her husband, betray her marriage, and violate her professional ethics. Now she gets to lie in it. Later that day, Art overheard two associates discussing the morning's events. I saw Mrs. Bellwether outside that coffee shop on 5th, one whispered. She looked awful. I heard she's been blacklisted everywhere, the other replied. Can't even get temp work. Nobody wants the liability. Maybe she should have thought about that before she broke, basically ethics rule in the book. Sure, he'll hear you. Art walked past them, noting how they immediately fell silent. Let them talk. Let them see. Let them understand that actions had consequences, and he would enforce them without mercy. His phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. Art, please. I'm about to lose my apartment. I have nowhere to go. Just talk to me. He blocked the number without responding. In his office, he found Maggie waiting. You saw her today, she said. Did Jax tell you? Didn't need to. I can read it in your posture. She studied him. Any regrets? About what? Exposing her unethical behavior? Ensuring she faced the consequences of her actions? Why should I regret justice? That's not what I asked. Art met her gaze. No, Maggie. No regrets. She chose her path. She chose to treat people as beneath her, to violate her professional ethics, to betray her marriage vows. Now she's learning that choices have consequences. And you're okay with being the one who enforced those consequences? Someone has to ensure justice is served. Why not me? Through his office windows, he could see the scholarship students working in the law library. They were the future, bright, ethical, dedicated. They would help build the legacy he envisioned for Sterling and Hayes. Beatrice was the past, a cautionary tale, a reminder that character revealed itself not in success, but in how people treated those they thought couldn't fight back. She had thought him weak. She had thought him powerless. She had been wrong, and now she would spend the rest of her life understanding just how wrong she had been. Chapter 9. The Silent Legacy. 5 years passed. Sterling and Hayes stood transformed, its reputation rebuilt on a foundation of integrity and excellence. The marble lobby now displayed a wall of achievements, awards for ethical business practices, recognition for pro bono work, and photographs of scholarship recipients who had become successful attorneys. Art sat in his office, reviewing the latest quarterly reports. The firm's profits had tripled under his leadership, proving that success and ethics weren't mutually exclusive. The Richardson case files, Mr. Bellwether, Ms. Rodriguez, his former scholarship recipient and now rising star attorney, placed the documents on his desk. Unlike the trembling junior associates of years past, she moved with confident professionalism. Your analysis? The client wanted us to blur some legal lines, she replied firmly. I recommended we decline the case. Art nodded, approval evident in his expression. Well done. Draft the rejection letter. After she left, Maggie entered, carrying the morning papers. Have you seen this? The headline caught his attention. Former star attorney pleads guilty to theft. The article detailed Monty Finch's latest fall from grace, caught stealing from his employer, a small-town legal aid office that had given him a chance after his disbarment. Some people never learn, Art commented, setting the paper aside. Speaking of learning, Maggie took her usual seat across from him. The new scholarship program expansion is ready to launch. 10 more slots, full funding. The scholarship initiative had become Sterling and Hayes' flagship program. Its graduates were sought after by top firms, known for their combination of skill and unwavering ethics. Good. What about the mentorship component? Already implemented. Each recipient gets paired with a senior partner. She paused. You're taking to yourself. They need to understand what real leadership looks like, Art stated. Not the corrupt version Monty represented. Not the ethical compromises Beatrice championed. Jax burst in, his energy barely tempered by the passing years. Boss, you're going to want to see this. Remember that pro bono case we took on? The whistleblower from Carlton Industries? We just found evidence of systematic fraud. Art's expression hardened with familiar intensity. Show me. As Jax pulled up the data, Art's mind worked through the implications. Another corporation thinking it could prey on the powerless. Another chance to demonstrate that actions had consequences. Start the documentation, he ordered. I want everything ready for the SEC by morning. Already on it. Oh, and... Jax hesitated. I thought you should know. Beatrice was hired as a legal secretary. Small firm in Nevada. Art's expression didn't change. Not relevant to our current business. Just thought you want to know. I don't... Art's tone ended the discussion. Later that day, Art led a training session for new associates. The firm's conference room was packed. Sterling and Hayes had become the most sought-after workplace for young lawyers. Ethics isn't about following rules, he told them. It's about understanding why the rules exist. It's about recognizing that our actions affect real people, real lives. A hand raised. Mr. Bellwether, is it true you worked as a janitor here? Yes, he answered without hesitation. I worked positions from mailroom to maintenance, learning this firm from the ground up. It taught me an essential truth. Character reveals itself in how people treat those they think can't fight back. The lesson wasn't lost on his audience. They'd all heard the stories of how he'd exposed corruption, how he'd rebuilt the firm from within. After the session, Maggie joined him in his office. Their relationship had deepened over the years, built on mutual respect and shared values. You didn't tell them about Beatrice, she observed. Her story isn't relevant to their training, isn't it? The mighty brought low by their own hubris. Art's expression remained firm. They need to learn about building something worthwhile, not just avoiding consequences. And what have you built, Arthur? He gestured to the office windows, where they could see the firm buzzing with purposeful activity. A place where excellence means more than profit. Where ethics isn't a buzzword but a foundation. Where power serves justice, not personal gain. And personally, his expression softened slightly as he looked at her. You know what you mean to me? Their relationship had grown naturally, built on trust and mutual understanding. She'd seen him at his most ruthless and his most vulnerable, and had matched his strength with her own. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, she reminded him. They're voting on the expansion proposal. Art nodded, gathering his materials. The firm was growing, opening new branches, extending its influence. Each expansion carried his grandfather's vision forward. Justice served with strength and integrity. Mr. Bellwether? His secretary interrupted. The State Bar Association called. They want you to speak at their ethics conference. Except, he replied, they need to understand that ethical practice isn't a constraint on success. It's the foundation of real achievement. As he prepared for the board meeting, Art reflected on his journey. From the invisible janitor to the feared CEO, from the betrayed husband to the architect of justice. He'd learned that true power wasn't in titles or wealth, but in the ability to enforce consequences, to shape reality according to one's principles. The lessons had been harsh. The price had been high. But he'd emerged stronger, more focused, more determined to build something lasting. He was no longer the man who'd pushed a mop bucket through these halls, hiding his power behind a mask of humility. He was no longer the husband who'd suffered betrayal in silence, accumulating evidence while nursing his wounds. He was Arthur Bellwether, a man who'd turned personal pain into professional principle, private betrayal into public justice. His grandfather would have understood. Power without purpose was meaningless, but purpose without power was helpless. Art had found both, the power to enforce consequences and the purpose to use that power wisely. Sterling and Hayes stood as his testament. Not just a law firm, but a monument to the principle that actions had consequences, that integrity mattered, that justice would be served. The sun lit the skyline through his office windows as he gathered his thoughts for the board meeting. Another day of building his legacy, of enforcing his principles, of ensuring that right prevailed. Arthur Bellwether smiled. His revenge was complete, his victory absolute. But more importantly, his future was secure, built on the foundations of strength, justice, and uncompromising principle. The silent partner had found his voice, and that voice would echo through the legal world for generations to come. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.